the rest of it. On the technical side,
Последний раз увидел, когда он сказал, что
a few other factors that are actually stuff that we would just release that as a non-test.
oh, we can't. Those are
Oh, you like me. If you didn't, you wouldn't have told me.
Well, at least you could distribute the load. And look at Google as a. You mean request for or request from? Request for or request from? Request by IP addresses that are owned by Google.
No.
From resolvers that are owned by Google?
Now that's a flip chart.
That's 50% of the for French.
Okay.
But it's actually kind of funny, all the very different specific choices. In particular, you use the informal too when you're talking to God.
Are you a French?
I am trying to learn French. So.
Why are you learning French?
Because I actually live near Quebec, and it turns out German is not my language. So,
Do you speak Spanish?
I do on my laptop, but it's now it's turning on after. I don't know if it's
So you can do everything in tabs over here.
Yes, I'm trying to get it for a second. Okay, everybody, it's 1:30, so let's start finding our seats and get started.
So, as you can see, the first thing we want to remind everybody about is the Note Well and Agenda Bash. So here's the agenda. Please take a glance at this if you would like to bash it. And here is the Note Well. So please read this Note Well. Take special note that the Note Well includes reminders to behave appropriately in this working group. We'll come back to that.
A little louder, please.
If there are no agenda bashes, then we'll move on with the rest of the agenda.
Well, and just a couple of quick notes. So I'm David Lawrence. This is Ben Schwartz. We will be co-chairing this working group forming BOF. But I also wanted to thank Tim Wazinski and Joe Lorenzo Hall for being our note takers on the Etherpad. If you'd like to follow along to make any corrections as you go, that will also be helpful. And Suzanne Wolf will be our Jabber scribe. Thank you.
So just in case everybody isn't coming in with the same understanding of how we got to where we are, the chairs thought we would start off with a quick review of the past couple of years of developments in this area. So over the past 4 years, there have been two major standards development efforts that have created new encrypted protocols for DNS. So here's the timeline from 2014 to 2018 of the development of DNS over TLS and DNS over HTTPS. Those began to get significant client implementation starting last year in 2018. So here's, again, a timeline of a few of the notable client implementations. We just yesterday had a very important announcement of another client implementation in the form of Microsoft Windows. So this list is now even more incomplete. Over the past few years, there have also been a very large number of server deployments and trial deployments. I've tried to break these up into a few different categories, but if you look down this list, you'll see quite a wide range of different kinds of entities that are operating these servers and likely are trying to achieve different kinds of purposes using the same underlying protocols. Just this year, there have been a large number of drafts presented to the various working groups related to configuration of DNS clients. So I certainly won't go through all of these here, but all of these are drafts introduced this year that that affect how DNS clients are configured. I suspect there are more that I've missed here, and there may well be more coming. A couple of these will be presented today. Only one of them, I believe, is currently adopted by a working group.
One thing I'd really like to point out here too is though a lot of the discussion that's been going on has centered around DNS over HTTPS, you can see from these drafts that we are not just talking about DNS over HTTPS, we are talking about the evolving DNS landscape, and it is not restricted by any stretch of the imagination to only DOE.
There have also been several drafts that are less focused on client configuration and more focused on systemic issues that are a result of either DNS over HTTPS deployment or other interesting changes over the past years in the way that DNS is deployed. This has been a set of drafts that have come up this year. None of these are currently adopted in a working group. This year, there have been a number of controversies regarding this topic. I'm not going to talk through these. I'm mostly surfacing these example headlines from the press as a way to remind people to be respectful with your comments during this session, that this is a very charged space, and we'd like to try to be focused and productive and cordial. And the purpose of our conversation today is to discuss forming a working group. This is a working group forming BOF. This is not a standards development meeting, so we are not debating the merits of particular standards proposals, and we are definitely not here to argue about controversies in the press. And the session is very short, only 90 minutes total. So please try to be brief. I will also try to be brief. If I remember the agenda right, am I in the right order here?
Yes.
Okay. Then our next session is, I believe, 10 minutes. Our next segment is 10 minutes for presentation and discussion of a proposal by Mozilla. I want to emphasize that this is not a standards development meeting. The purpose of these presentations here is to provide us with some examples of the kinds of work that a working group might adopt if a working group is formed, but we are not here to talk through a full discussion of these of any standards proposals here. Thank you, Andy.
All right, thank you to the chairs. Yeah, so this is less of a proposal right now and more of just kind of like more of a report and explanation of our current experience with rolling out DOE and particularly the use of what we're calling a canary domain. So, Mozilla has taken an inclusive position in terms of enabling DOE for US users of our products. Now that one of the side effects, well, there's a couple of different side effects, which I'm sure a lot of you are aware of, but the consequences of us doing that is that we're working to mitigate those as much as possible. So one of the things that application-based DNS does is it bypasses any sort of DNS-based parental controls that are present on the network. So what we want to do is to detect when a network has those DNS-based parental controls present and then disable DOE on the assumption that the presence of those parental controls or policy, whatever policy is there is wanted by the network operator and is probably more important than that's something they want, and it supersedes the importance of Doe for the user. So we have a lot of different heuristics that we're using to work on this issue, to work on some of the other issues, but I'm going to be talking about the canary for parental controls. So the first issue is to detect DNS-based parental controls, and it's not good to like take a experimental approach and like try to trigger this for actual domains, because I think it's kind of self-obvious, but if there's logging or something like that, if they're explicit domains, then we don't want the user to be tagged as having visited them when they actually haven't. It's their software that's doing that. So what we tried to do instead, or what we're trying to do instead, is to designate a safe canary domain. So canary in the sense that, if anybody is familiar with the canary in the coal mine, it's like something not directly related to the thing that you're trying to determine, but it's a strong indicator of the thing that you're trying to determine. So see if the canary dies, and then you know that that's the case. So the disadvantage of this is that it requires whoever's running the policy to actually do something proactive to enable to block this additional domain, as opposed to just relying on whatever the current settings of their software. So we tried to make that as easy as possible to do. But the essence of it is that if the browser tries to resolve the domain and it gets a blocked or a modified results, then we deduce that means that the DNS policy is present, and we disable Doe. So, and you can have multiple canary domains. So obviously you don't really want that many, because it's kind of a pain to keep track of them and make sure that you're hitting them all. So that's kind of one of the reasons to be here, is if you have a global or a more common canary domain, then you don't have to hit one for ISP A through Z sort of thing. So the name of our canary domain is useapplicationdns.net. As we roll out making Doe the default, we resolve this using the platform DNS. And if there's an error that comes back, or if there's a success result but it doesn't contain an A or quad A result, then we take that as being a positive indication that the canary domain is triggered and disable Doe. So this requires some work on the server side or in the network side to enable that, and we've tried to make that as easy as possible. So if you're using parental control software, then presumably there's some easy to use UI to flag domains, and we've also talked to some parental control software providers, and that's something that they're interested in adding. And sometimes you just like, hey, we're interested in doing this, and they're like, oh, we already blocked it. Okay, so if you're using Bind 9, then the use of a response policy zone is a good way to do it. And we also heard from when we started talking about this and blogging about this, we heard from some people using other DNS servers so our initial approach was to just treat an NX domain as triggering the canary, and we changed that so that any error result and any success result besides that didn't return A or quad A was to kind of make it easier for whatever your software is to engage the canary domain if you want to. So Pi-hole has added support for it, and just kind of my sense is that people are aware of it, and we have an email address where people are like commenting on their use of it, and it seems like it's getting some uptake. We're running studies. Well, we've been running a lot of studies leading up to the decision to roll out Doe, and we continue to do that, and looking at the heuristics and the percentages of users that are disabling Doe or would have Doe disabled depending on the various heuristics. And we're seeing non-trivial amounts of triggering the canary domain. So contrary to what the slide says, I just got an update this morning. So Firefox, this is only in the United States, but Do has rolled out to 1% of the users and is going to be rolling out to another 1% of the users very soon. So we're continuing to monitor all the heuristics, but the canary domain usage via telemetry. And one thing that we're concerned about is that it's really based upon what the end network operator has decided that they want to do, rather than some higher level network operator. So we're watching for abuse and making sure that the canary domain blocking is at the end customer level. So here's a couple preemptive why didn't yous. Why didn't you wait for standardization? Well, we floated a extremely flimsy trial balloon about 6 months ago, but we really needed a solution quickly. And we, especially when we came to the conclusion that we were going to require people to add something or change their configuration in the network some way, that we make that as easy as possible. And we couldn't, we wanted to make that as easy and as fast as possible, and avoid any sort of new versions or anything like that, which was kind of some of the initial feedback was, well, why don't you, there was kind of more expansive, maybe better solutions, but that would have required those software changes. But we really needed something pretty quickly. The other piece of technical feedback that we've received is that instead of looking at a positive result, or a positive result being the canary domain failing to resolve, that it should be the positive canary result should be the canary domain resolving. So that didn't seem to be quite as good to us for the two reasons listed there. That was kind of like a little bit, I mean, if you just if you have a parental control solution and then you just add another thing to the block list, that's like a very natural thing to do, as opposed to having the logic be the opposite way. And the other piece of that is that the NX domain substitution can cause trouble with that approach as well. So that's basically it. We've kind of done this thing on our own. Seems to be working, but it is kind of a unilateral thing, and we'd like to look at standardization and see if it'd be useful for other people, and that we could move off that into a more standard thing. So increased adoption would be good. Fewer canary domains would be good. That would make it easier for applications. We also were a little bit stymied by, having to have an actual a .NET, whereas if it could be in a reserved domain, then that might be nicer. So we're interested in working on a candidate for workgroup adoption. So.
Ted Hardy, one quick clarifying question and then one comment. The clarifying question is, it appeared from what you were saying that this logic is only invoked if Do is present because of the default. If a user is configured a Do server, would you use the same logic?
No, if someone configures Do on, then it is just on.
Thank you for the clarification. The other point I wanted to say is for possible reserved names, the IAB has made names under .arpa available under much less difficult processes than reserved TLDs. So you may want to consider whether your reserved domain actually needs to be a TLD to do its function. Because
we were thinking something under .arpa would be.
Thanks for the clarification on that as well.
Thanks.
Brian Dixon, GoDaddy. Excuse me. You were mentioning that this is one of several heuristics. I was wondering if you would be willing to publish or share those and maybe standardize on those as well.
Well, they're implemented via a plugin which we've made public. So is that sufficient? Or we could, sure. Thanks.
So just to sharpen that point, we do publish so they publish in several ways. We have a blog post that describes what they do, and we have and then of course the source code for this is run by a web extension, and the source code of the web extension is public, so you can see directly what they do. unfortunately, they're probably not really suitable for standardization because they're basically looking at like operating system APIs, or looking to see whether someone is configuring, a Firefox, various Firefox properties. So they're not really standardizable. Though certainly I know there's been conversations about the operating systems exposing some API that indicated that the user had made conscious choices, like it didn't like Doe or something like that, or parental controls were on, and that's a potential area for standardization.
I characterize them more as techniques rather than.
Yeah, but I would expect those probably to be that to be driven by the operating system vendors rather than by the consumers.
Yeah.
Okay. Roy, before you go, I just want to remind everybody, this is just an informational session. And so quick comments, because to keep on the agenda, we're going to have to move on to the next presentations.
Roy Adams from ICANN. I'll keep it short. The canary domain is useApplicationDNS.net. It's a two-label domain. In bind, I need to use, as an operator, I need to use now policy zones. It would be much simpler, much more straightforward, if I can configure a zone, let's say useApplicationDNS.net, and deny the existence of x.useApplicationDNS.net. In order to deny it now, I either need to use the policy zone, which is kind of complex, or I need to locally configure the net zone in order to deny useApplicationDNS.net. So may I suggest to make that domain have another label in front of it? If that makes any sense. If we need more clarification, we can take this off mic.
Okay, thank you.
Bernie Hoeneisen. I have a little of a problem to do parental control.
Louder, please.
Okay. I have a little problem about parental control doing it via DNS at the first place. I think it's an awful idea to do parental control via DNS in the first place. So I'm not quite sure whether we should really help to do things the wrong way by bringing this forward. Was just a comment.
Yeah. Well, people are doing it, so yeah.
Doesn't mean that we need to support them.
Kind of do.
David Skenazy, Google Chrome. Oh, this mic is sorry. I just wanted to share that there is first off, this makes sense to me, but also there's precedent. The IETF has standardized IPv4 only.ARPA, and it's kind of similar to this, where by spec it exists to only return 2A records and nothing else, and operators override those results to share with clients that there is a DNS64 and a NAT64 on the network. So we have precedent for specifically using DNS as a way to say, hey, you override this, by overriding this, you get the functionality you want. So this seems very similar. It makes sense to me.
Yeah.
And with apologies, I'm closing the mic line because Tommy, can you come up for your presentation? While he's walking, go.
Okay. All right. Remy Nguyen Van from Google Android. One just comment I found a little confusing is that so the whole presentation focuses on basically the usage for parental control, but I don't see anything in particular that, I mean, for me, like parental control is just like one subset of censorship, basically. And I don't see anything in here that, you know, is specific to parental control compared to like in general, whatever you could use for censorship in general. And so considering that, I think, you know, in further communication, it might be better to like refer to the general concept, unless there's like some measure that makes it so you can only use it for parental control only.
Well, yeah, it's it's like a DNS policy, so it's commonly used for parental control, but it could, yeah, you're right, it could be used for other things by other entities. Yeah.
Okay, so 15 minutes.
Yep. Including.
Yeah. Yep. I got it. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Tommy Pauly from Apple. So in light of the fact that this is, you know, informational for you guys, there's, you know, two sides of this. One is to share some of the work that we are doing at Apple as a kind of an operating system level thing. We have a lot of experience of people trying to do Doe in the browser. Right now, you know, we have people looking at how to do it as an operating system service in the system resolver. We've gotten a lot of good feedback already on this, also from the teams at Android as well as the Microsoft Windows DNS teams. So part of it is just to share this information, but then hopefully also the questions we're trying to address in this as we're working on design architecture are some of the things that if ABCD is a group, it would likely come up. And so right now, these are a couple of documents that we have put forward in dprive. And so we'll be presenting those later in the week. If you think that those make sense in dprive, then that may influence kind of like where we see this particular group going. All right, so we have this overall thing, we're calling it adaptive DNS privacy. So what does it mean? So here we have the normal status quo DNS setup. And when we look at the different parties involved, we have our client device, it's talking to some local resolver, generally at least a locally provisioned resolver using standard DNS over UDP port 53. And then there's some actual origin server that I'm connecting to, example.com. So what we've seen with a lot of the Doe deployments so far is something that's a little bit more like this. We are, potentially skipping that first step, and we have some other external public recursive Doe that we're using instead to replace that role. So that achieves some goals. I think people are doing this because of privacy, but it also has other concerns that have been clearly brought up on the ADD list and others. So when I look at this from the point of view of the operating system, there's a couple of different questions that come to mind. And I want to go through those, what we're thinking here as some of the prompts for this group. So first, how do we, as a client, discover the different encrypted resolvers that are available? Not necessarily when to use them, but just their existence. Next, how do we understand the local policy of the network? That's kind of like the Canario domain that we just saw. And then kind of the big one, if we're doing this at a system level and not just in a browser, like how do we know as a client what are the right things to use at the right times? Because there can be some very complex scenarios going on. So I'm going to go through all three of these and that'll be the talk. So first, how do we discover different resolvers? So there's a couple different options. I think what we're seeing today, oftentimes we have some hard-coded list of things that we've whitelisted and audited in. That's one approach, certainly. You can also, there have been proposals to do things like bootstrapping off of an HTTP connection. You almost like an alt service type thing where you connect, you learn that this thing supports Doe, and then in the future you start using Doe. From a privacy perspective, that's not necessarily great because it's very opportunistic. It's a little bit lazy on that regard. So what we're proposing here, this is just one option, is actually using records in the DNS, ideally DNSSEC signed records that can prove some official designation of what a zone wants to use as its associated trusted resolver. The point of this is saying that if I'm going to a Google domain, then it's probably appropriate to use a Google resolver. It'll have accurate results. It will allow us to do connection coalescing. And it actually kind of makes this, it reduces the number of parties that are involved in this overall system, which is a good privacy benefit. And then just as a quick aside here, one of the things, of course, that's been coming up is the choice of protocol. And so I want to explain why we're talking about Doe here, even though, of course, DOT is available. Oftentimes, the choice of Doe is being described as a way to hide the traffic, to make it invisible that we're doing DNS resolution. That may be some people's goal, but I think in this case, there are a lot of other benefits of Doe that I do want to highlight. It allows us to do multiplexing, and if we are indeed doing resolution of Google names to Google servers, there's a much higher chance that we're going to end up seeing coalescing and getting benefit of multiplexing. It also allows us to get more of a direct transition to quick. We can go from HTTP 2 to HTTP 3 without redefining a protocol mapping. It also allows proxying of requests, which I'll get into a bit later. So essentially the world with a designated DNS service, a designated Doe server kind of looks like this. We still have our local resolver, but we're also aware that there is a designation for example.com to a certain resolver that may be a public resolver that's handling its resolution. So then we also want to look at how do we handle local policy that's being advertised. So again, we have options like doing canary domains. This is, I think, a really good first step, although maybe it's not the long-term architecture that we want. You could also put things in DHCP or RA options. What we're doing right here is using something that we are, it's an extension off of RAs called provisioning domains. It allows us to fetch a fairly large blob that's fetched off of a HTTPS connection. It's a JSON blob that's a bit flexible here. And we imagine that this type of information can be used to indicate walled garden status, captive status, as well as filtering rules. And so it's essentially, how do I use this network? What are the things that are available? And one of the important things here also is even in cases in which I'm allowed to use DOE to public services, we may want to break out certain services locally. So, you know, I have Comcast as my ISP, and if I have local Xfinity streaming services that are very well optimized, it'd be great to do my DNS and ideally DOE to Comcast over the local network. The same goes for enterprise network scenarios in which we need to know kind of like the split DNS world here. So we need to be very cognizant of split DNS as we are doing this solution for local networks. So we kind of get a world like this in which we have different DOE servers hanging about. This can just be for reference. This is the type of thing that we're currently defining that the local network can indicate. As we had some discussions with various ISPs, and I think we're going to have scenarios in which we have some required filtering, in which is like, oh, let's say I have a school environment. This really needs to be locked down, and they're essentially indicating ahead of time, we will block you if you try to evade this, and like that's going to be bad news. But you can also have things that are more opt-in services of saying, this is a parental controls, that's nice to do, but if the user does specify a specific DOE server they want to use as an override, or if they're in some private browsing mode, they would be allowed to go and the network wouldn't actively block those connections. So it'd be good to know that type of stance as well. And lastly, the draft that we have, the adaptive DNS one, talks a lot about the client algorithm for what's the right thing to use. And I think this is going to be at the heart of a lot of the stuff that may come up in this BOF and in this group. So here's like a little flow chart of kind of the precedence of how we would fall through things. Because we need to take into account things like VPNs that like we must do first. We don't want to have the idea of DOE servers kind of overriding things that we have as enterprise type policy. We also want to make sure that we do highly respect the services that are local, that are either on our home network, local network, or things that we know are locally provisioned, and we can have proof that these are things that the local network is truly authoritative for. We also want to then kind of use these provable designations for other public services. We have a way to do for like a privacy mode. We're also proposing an oblivious DOE mechanism for cases in which we don't trust the network. And then kind of like the last case is using the direct scenario. So overall, the picture can get pretty complicated, a lot of different things going all over the place. This is, you know, one way the world can work. One question that can come up on all of this is, you know, how do we bootstrap this world if we, you know, so there are different ways of setting up these designations. If we do trust the local network and we aren't too worried about things, then, you know, I connect to Google, I do a resolution for Google the first time, I say, oh, Google has a public DOE server I can use, I bootstrap off of that. If I don't trust the local network, that's what we have this scenario for oblivious DOE going on, and you can find out more about that at dprive. Anyway, so that's it. We do have some drafts, they are in dprive. You can file issues, read about them, make pull requests at the GitHub, and we also have some sample code that's available. All right.
Hi, Tommy. It's Eric Pascola. One thing that I've been trying to sort out is, well, so as you know, we have this problem with ESNI, where where single domain is serving multiple CDNs. So I think you see where I'm about to go with this. What happens if, say, I have a domain which is served by you know, two CDNs, which we'll call A and B, A decide, and so when I contact, and A decides to publish a record saying that it should be the designated server for that domain.
Yep.
what is the impact of that? Doesn't that effectively pin me to A more or less indefinitely?
Right. So this is one of the kind of issues and stuff we're looking at. Just as a quick answer, I think there's two general approaches we can take. What we're using to communicate this designation is actually the same record that we're going to be using for ESNI. And so you could have just two designations, and presumably if I'm doing more resolutions through A's DO server, it should also not hide the fact that there is a designation for B as well. And there's another solution that you could imagine is that the owner of the domain that's doing the load balancing between the CDNs does have essentially either one of them or some third entity as the one designated thing that's doing the load balancing across.
Sure.
And that's okay.
My concern is that each of them decides to make themselves designated and then
And not tell you about the other.
not tell you the other one, and then
That would be
effectively the status quo gets pinned at one particular load balancing set, and then it never can be changed because people never forget, right? So I think that's the thing I'm most concerned about. So that we can do this offline, but that's a situation I'm interested in.
That's definitely something good to explore. Hey, Warren.
Warren Kamari, Google. Can you go back to 14? It's possible I'm asking the same question as Ecker, but I'm not sure.
Yes.
So for the designated DO server, can I also say that the google.com servers should be able to resolve YouTube?
Yes.
Can I also say that they should be able to resolve Apple?
Right.
How
And so
do you-
this
the
is
same-
where, the notion of, okay, where do you get the authority from? So what we are saying in this document is these records that give these designations should be DNSSEC signed so that we have proof that the person who does have authority over that name is truly indicating this relationship. Not everyone loves DNSSEC, but I think it points to like you need some way to prove this relationship that you can't just claim authority over something else, right? That's general for any solution, I think.
Yeah, Riak. So first I want to thank you. I think this is very interesting and potentially very, very useful. One of my concerns, at least with some of the deployment models has been that you end up with too much centralization and you're
Trying to fight that.
able to provide multiple parties that provide different types of services. So that's a big improvement. So that's good. I did have a more technical question about like do you support the case where or what do you do in a situation where multiple parties might be sort of like you would end up with multiple entities that can resolve a particular name, or do you have that case to begin with?
Right, so this is kind of similar to Ecker's point. I think the fact that a DO server could resolve many things, like a lot of these could be, if I talk to Cloudflare for something or Quad 8, it can resolve the whole internet. The question is, when should I do it? And it gets into the notion of, do I have a strong designation, an indication from the zone owner, some signed record that says, yes, this is the thing you should use for this period of time. So I think it gets into the same conversation, and so I think we should kind of loop that all together.
Yeah, all right, thanks.
Thank you.
Ralph Weber Ackermann, and I love DNSSEC, so that's the part of the draft I certainly approve of. I mean, there's a more, I think, probably technical discussion on Friday.
Yes.
The one thing that concerns me a bit, I mean, it is a fairly complex picture.
Yeah.
How are we going to debug this, or how can we make sure that it's kind of bulletproof so that kind of my ISP doesn't get a call from me because it doesn't work?
Right. So I think we can dig into this more. There's different scenarios. Like let's say that I am in a case in which I am trusting my ISP for the bootstrapping. At that point, it would know the first time I talk into a given zone, right? Like the first time I resolve Google, and then at that point, Google becomes encrypted over DO. So, hopefully it would be able to debug kind of like those initial things, and then essentially any name that I see off of Google after that point, it's kind of the Google DO server's fault if there's a problem there. So, and potentially, because we will have official records within the DNS, that are DNSSEC signed records that are public about which domains are going to which places, we'll be able to kind of trace down where the errors may be occurring and know who's the authority to talk to.
And you want to then expose that to the user, or what is the plan for that?
And so 2 quick things to be clear. We're a little behind on the agenda, so the line's definitely closed after Brian. And I think this is an excellent example, though, of why bringing this work to the IETF can ferret out all the corner cases and interesting things that we really want to have nailed down.
Ray Bellis, ISC. Can you go back one again to 14?
This is a fun one.
Yeah. So there's at least one box missing on that one, which is names that are not DNS names. For example, stuff from nsswitch.conf. So yeah, Etsy localhost, other naming systems that are not DNS.
Yep.
The stuff that the operating system will do for you for free if you're using get address by name or similar.
Yes, it's a great point. File an issue.
Brian Dixon, GoDaddy. Go forward a slide or two. Yeah. So what I'm wondering about is from a scalability and caching perspective, whether having the client flip from one to another resolver, whether it might be worth considering having the first one be a forwarder and taking advantage of the scalability of client queries. Anybody who's connected to the closest cache to them, forwarding, is going to benefit if other people are making the same kind of queries, plus it's going to have more local benefit.
Yeah, that's fair. There is definitely the privacy aspect in which we don't necessarily want to put all of our names through something that can see things that we don't trust. Also, one of the benefits of going to things that are not necessarily authorities, but something that are designated, is that they should have really high hit rates, right? Like, so if I go to the Google Doe server and everyone else is going to that particular server for those names, or at least their local pop of it, it should have a pretty high hit rate, and they'll be actually able to really well optimize their content. That's the goal from this. It should provide a lot of opportunities to different content providers. Anyway, thank you for the time. I don't want to abuse any more of it.
So we're now entering the chartering discussion phase of the meeting. And just to kick that off, I wanted to show a few slides to remind people what we're talking about. There was an original...
I'll take one interruption here just to kind of, for those of you not familiar with the process of a working group forming BOF, what we're looking here is trying to identify whether there are concrete work items that we could adopt in that make sense to have their own working group for us to focus on being able to work toward actual deliverables. And of note, a couple of things is the final decision, of course, is not really up to this room. It is ultimately up to the ISG, but whatever discussion while we are presenting a draft possibility for the charter, we are discussing that here and able to modify it as seems appropriate. We will be trying to drill down on some of the stickier questions there. And also of note, so the final determination of like what we would like to advance to the ISG to make a final decision about chartering a working group will of course take, as part of normal IETF processes, will take place online. And also important to note, although Ben and I were co-chairs of DOE and then our co-chairs of this BOF, we are not necessarily the co-chairs of your new working group. That is a separate matter to be determined. So if that kind of influences your decision about which way you think things should go, that's a separate issue to the chartering discussion.
Thanks, David. So there was a when this working group forming BOF was announced, it was announced with a draft charter in order to solicit feedback. That feedback largely came on the ADD mailing list. There was quite a bit of discussion of that draft of the charter. Based on that feedback, we attempted to produce an updated charter proposal that reflected as much of that feedback as we could manage. And I wanted to highlight some of the differences from that original charter proposal. There's also since been extensive discussion on the list of this latest draft of the charter proposal, and we'll have some more discussion of that today. So the first set of notable changes are in what the original draft called initial areas of focus. We've clearly expanded the detailing of what these areas are to try to clarify precisely what it is that might be of interest to this working group. And these are intended to be essentially technical and less controversial working group items that more or less reflect the kinds of interests that we saw in this year's technical drafts on client behavior that I mentioned in an earlier slide. And the second set of changes are related to what the original draft described as best current practices. So the latest draft, again, changes the phrasing and expands and details some of these potential best practice areas, and also, in particular, adds a condition for discussion of these working group items, that because they are highly controversial, that we are going to, that this charter would restrict the working group's consideration of these topics to avoid them essentially overwhelming the less controversial topics, essentially saying that they can be discussed, but they can't be argued. So if you, basically, if there's substantial disagreement within the working group, those disagreements have to be resolved outside the working group, not during working group time, in order to allow the working group to continue to make progress on less controversial topics. So that is the current proposed charter text. I'm also going to pull up here the full current draft charter. And the rest of this time is open discussion, but as the first topic, I would encourage you to consider especially the question of these controversial topics, which has been much debated on the mailing list. It seems to me that there are essentially three major considerations here: whether we should essentially keep the text more or less as it is, whether we should render these topics as included in the working group scope without any special conditions, or whether we should exclude them entirely.
And one last thing that I'd like to request, as you're making your microphone comments, please also offer just a general statement about whether you support the formation of a working group at all. And then on that point that Ben brought up, what your particular feeling is as far as resolving or dealing with these controversial areas.
Okay, Aaron Falk, Akamai. I was confused by the term full consensus in that slide. And I was wondering, are you trying to set a different standard for how to admit these topics? Or were you just trying to be clear? Because you weren't, that wasn't clear to me. So anyways, that's it.
Sure, so I think I may be to blame for the full consensus line. My interpretation of that line is to say that essentially in the course of the working group, if somebody comes up to the microphone and says, no, we're not going to do, like, I don't want to do it this way, then the further argument between proponents and opponents on those topics has to happen outside the working group, and the working group can move on to other topics.
I think that's a really interesting idea. That's not what I thought full consensus, that's not what I understood the phrase to mean. So you might want to clarify that.
Jen Linkova, random network operator. I'm excited to see this happening because I'm a bit scared about potential implication for networks I'm running. So it might sound like a nitpicking, but I would love to see DNS 6.4 being explicitly mentioned as a thing we need to think about, because I suspect some of that behavior might have unexpected implications for v6-only networks with DNS 6.4.
David Skenazy, DNS enthusiast. Could you go back to the slide? I think it was changes between the charter, but the first one. Yes, this one. Those items on the right, well, first off, that's a lot. Secondly, I wouldn't try to say exactly which ones, but a lot of these are already in the charter of DNS op. And that sounds strange to me that this charter is conflicting with an existing working group.
So yes, I'd definitely like to address that particular point in that, so in particular, as you may recall, ABCD is application behavior considering DNS. And so the audience is actually much broader than the typical audience for DNS op. And DNS op itself is now 3 working group chairs and very frequently 2 sessions at every IETF. There's a lot going on in DNS op, and a lot of people that are interested in these other areas are not interested in participating in the full breadth of DNS op. And so the thought, you'll will also have noticed in the draft charter that there's a paragraph at the end that says, you know, we will closely be this working group would be closely working with both DPRIVE and DNSOP in doing its business. And I personally, speaking without a hat, but just my own personal expectation, would be that the chairs of each of the working groups would be working closely to identify which particular working group would be most suited to the type of work that's being done. Some of these things I agree, I think are more specifically DNSOP. Quite a few of them, I think the questions are a little bit greater where they would find their best home. And so the idea for forming the separate working group, though, is to increase participation from the community that would not normally otherwise participate in the full volume of DNSOP.
So, thank you. That does clarify things, but I'm not sure. So maybe someone can tell me if there's precedent here, but saying that another working group agenda is too full doesn't sound like a good reason to form something else. And I'm not saying we shouldn't form this. Like, I'm just saying a lot of these items, like DNS should be debuggable. Like, that's an operational issue of the DNS, and we have a working group for that. So I think this needs to be narrowed a lot.
Yariak. So I think there's a lot of interesting work that could be done. Everything that we seen today. I do agree that this list, while I like this list, it's also indeed a little bit long. I think these kinds of both meetings go best if we don't focus too much on where the work actually ends up, whether it's in this working group or some other working group. That's a management issue that you guys and the IESG will handle somehow. But we should focus on which things actually we believe are needed and useful and should be done and are not yet done. Obviously, if they already are being addressed somewhere else, then we shouldn't list it here. So that's one comment. The other comment is on your other list. While I basically agree with much of what is said here, I do take exception with one of these items, and that is the privacy and pervasive surveillance item. And I think it's our job to worry about things such as end-user privacy and pervasive surveillance. And when we are working on these topics, like some of the proposed work items include like these architectures that would do some kind of distribution, and to not be able to analyze what the impacts of those architectures, or if we don't do those architectures, is. That seems like a major miss. And also, I believe it's according to our PCPs that we have to address some of these issues if we work on particular pieces of technology. Thank you.
So on that topic, I would just note that this is not a list of items that are out of scope for the working group. This is a list of items where the working group should not engage in argument.
If I can follow up briefly. I get that, but it doesn't seem very realistic, to be honest. And there are some topics that are hard, but these are hard things that we actually need to address them.
Our note taker has helpfully noted that this is a danger list. Right, on this particular, like the IETF, as I've mentioned in the past, one of the challenges is that we very frequently like to say that we don't do policy, but it's also very clear that a lot of technology we develop greases policy skids one direction or the other. And in this particular area, at least, the IETF came out with a very clear statement on how it perceives pervasive monitoring, and therefore the design of protocols that are enhancing our defenses against pervasive surveillance also have this additional problem of blocking benign surveillance. And danger, just even using those terms together, I realize is a giant minefield, but the intent of this bullet point was to say that arguing that point back and forth is not going to be a productive discussion in the working group.
Patrick McManus, just for clarity, are our chairs acting as proponents of this BOF? Are the chairs acting as proponents of forming this working group?
I personally am a proponent of the existence of the working group, yes.
So
Yeah, I guess for myself, and by the way, we would encourage people in the line to tell us what you think on the topic. I don't mean to be supporting or opposing formation of the working group. I did put some work into the
asked 'cause we
text,
seem
so
to
I
be
want to
having a
make sure that
dialogue where
people understand the text.
We seem to be having a dialogue where people make comments and then you respond as if you are proponents for the responses. And that's an unusual model. The most important question in front of us is whether this BOF has a charter in front of us that should be used as the basis for a new working group. I don't believe that is so for a bunch of reasons. One, the charter lacks specificity. In fact, it actually has no deliverables in the charter at all, but almost everything is in scope. We need consensus that any deliverables have a high chance of success, but there's no clarity on what those deliverables might be. The charter relies on a number of new concepts that are not really normal IETF consensus processes. The notion of full consensus and the more novel topic that some things are relevant, but the group shall not try and resolve their disagreement on them. This has a low probability, I would suggest, of working at all. And, you know, most importantly, this is not a matter of just refining the charter. I really think this is inherent in the nature of what we're discussing here. This is politics that is not well suited to our consensus process. So RFC 5434 has some considerations for a successful BOF. We might look at those. Is the scope of the problem well understood? And that is, are people generally understand what the working group will work on? I suggest, you know, there are no deliverables, so that's not really very clear. There's an agreement that the specific set of deliverables are the right set. Perhaps the null set is the right set. I'll go that far. Is it believed that the working group has a reasonable probability of having success, i.e. in completing the deliverables in the charter in a timely fashion? Well, there are no deliverables, so I guess we kind of got that one in the bag. You know, and 5434 also asks for specificity from the BOF proponents in what questions will be asked, because that is the question in front of us. I'm still not sure exactly, you know, what that will be. So I think this isn't ready for a working group.
Eric Scorla, a longtime listener, first-time caller. Yeah, I mean, wow, Patrick, that was, you made me almost irrelevant. Almost. So let's take a step back and remember the history of what's happened here, which is the IETF published specification, published DOE, there was consensus on the specification, mission accomplished. And then there was discussion of deployment of the specification. Vendors made a bunch of decisions about how they were going to do it. Different vendors made different decisions and then announcements. A bunch of people were sad about those decisions. And we've now spent basically the past year going back and forth between the people who thought the decisions were good and the people who thought the decisions were bad. And now that's a perfectly healthy kind of debate. I think we have not advanced like 1 nanometer in actually getting consensus from like the positions we started on. So that's not been super helpful. And so the question now is, what are we to do? As Hanna Schofenig pointed out in Montreal, we publish technical specifications. That's the purpose of this enterprise we are all collectively in. And so we're going to ask, what technical specifications can we publish that are the output of this work? And so the some of the things on your like group 1 list, you know, of things we might work on seem like interesting ideas. I'm particularly interested in number 2. There's way too many there. We ought to start small and make some progress on one of them. The second things are the things you do at like an Oxford Debating Society, which we are not. Like, it is not a good use of our time to attempt to reach resolution on things which you already know we have violent disagreement upon and we don't have common ground. So I think that while I appreciate your full consensus suggestion, I think striking those entirely would be much better. And if people wish to discuss those in some other forum, perhaps you could find another way to do that.
Well, I'm not sure if I should maybe let somebody else speak after Ecker, just so that I can compose myself. I will let a couple of people go ahead.
Mark Nottingham. I do not think we should contemplate a charter in this form or a similar form for a working group.
They can, yeah.
In my experience, working groups set up in this fashion are very likely to fail. You're building conflict into the charter. It's much better to have something small and distinct that you know you can get agreement on, that we want to do this and move that forward. And that, in my experience, is a much more successful model for a charter. I acknowledge we need to continue discussing this. We need a forum for that discussion. That doesn't have to be a working group, though. And what I'm concerned about is that there are some interesting and I think useful things in this space. I especially like Tommy's proposal, that if they were adopted by a working group like this, they would be put at risk by the circus that would surround it. So strongly against this charter or anything like it.
Hi, Brian Trammell. I actually kind of like the charter on the left more than the charter on the right. Like this looks like, I mean, people often say, you know, the IETF process is terrible because it leads to protocols designed by committee. This reads like a charter designed by committee because it actually was. I think that is it's useful to basically have had the discussion to say, let's expand the list of things that we're willing to consider, because I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this space. I'll say when I was looking at the two sort of introductory presentations here, I was like, oh, that all looks like, those look like interesting, small, well-scoped questions that like would work perfectly in a working group, and I can see the deliverable, and this sounds great. And maybe saying, like, going over and saying, so both of them had to do with the resolver discovery and sort of the generalized, how do I figure out what my environment looks like for resolution, which is what's kind of missing from DOE, right? Like, so that's where the technical friction is here. And I would say, going back, looking at all of the input we've gotten from the community on sort of what needs to be in the latest draft, and saying, let's pick one, and then explicitly in the charter say close or recharter, right? It's like doing these in a more serial way will be much more productive. You can actually write down deliverables, which makes it easy to determine whether they're the right deliverables. And it fixes the problem that people came in the door with at the beginning, right? Like, so the resolver discovery thing does actually seem like it needs work, and it needs work quicker than we're going to get to if we argue over the exact scope of the thing on the right. I have opinions about the next slide, but I don't want you to put the next slide up in order to talk about them because it's kind of like red meat and red flags and rah. So I would say in chartering a working group based on a cut down version of this charter that looks more like the one before the discussion makes sense, and you really need to. We need to have like it's going to require disciplined chairs, right? Like, it's not going to be a thing. It's like, hey, we're going to talk about these things, but only like in full consensus. It's actually going to be, here are a list of things we're talk about outside of the scope of the very specific technical decisions that we're making on the deliverables. So with that caveat, I think that this working group really needs to exist, not with this charter, but I would hope that we could iterate on this on the list and do like spin something up before Vancouver. Thank you.
Jim Reed. I'm a supporter of creating a working group, something similar to this lines, and I'm broadly happy with the charter that's been proposed, the updated charter that's been put in place at the moment. I think the choice of the word full consensus has perhaps been a little bit unfortunate, because that's created various bits of confusion, misunderstandings, and that's maybe something that needs to be tweaked. Yes, some of the deliverables are maybe could be fleshed out a little bit more, but I have to disagree with one of the points that Mark was making earlier about the potential for this thing to go bad very, very quickly when we discuss some of the topics that we discussed before. I think those problems, yes, there are theoretical possibility, and provided the working group behaves itself, again, that's maybe a bit of an unknown, but if the working group behaved itself, this shouldn't become a problem. And if we get into territory which is likely to cause lack of consensus, or people start to misbehave, that's when it'd be down to the working group chairs to intervene and to get people to either see sense or shut up or behave themselves. And if you've got a strong working group chairs, a strong AD to make those kind of interventions in a timely manner before things go off at tangents and we end up having a slanging match, then things should keep themselves pretty much in line. Yes, there's a theoretical risk that things could maybe go wrong, but provided we've got the right leadership and a degree of common sense, this shouldn't happen. Maybe I'm just being too optimistic about that, but I think we can solve these problems without too much difficulty and get down to the job of solving the real issues, such as the ones that we've been talked about before in the two presentations, before we go on to the charter discussion. Thank you.
Brian Nixon, GoDaddy. There's one thing on, I think, the next slide. If you could pop that forward just for a second. From the right-hand side, the first bullet, I think that bullet point might better be handled through making that a required element of any working group draft as a section, the same as currently there's security requirements for a security section. Given the nature and scope of the working group, if it forms, I think that would be sufficient for addressing that. And please get rid of that slide, go back one. Sorry. On the issue of some of the consensus, specifically the single person saying no, that's a huge red flag for me. From a process, this flies back to my experience over the last 20 years in the IETF, where there's been a lot of bad behavior that is under the covers or behind the scenes that has been alluded to by various different people and has left a lot of bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. This is exactly the wrong approach to take, in my opinion. I would prefer to see something a little more neutral, geared towards a strong working group chair, and something that at least requires something like a Robert's Rules, nominate and second. We really want to avoid blocking valid and valuable contributions and discussions, even if they are contentious. General rough consensus is not the same as unanimity. And I think that is extremely important in some of the issues. And thirdly, from a process perspective, I think something having been previously established in some working group somewhere should not preempt revisiting some of those discussions. This is specific to one particular area, but I think as a process, we should be open to discussing those without being, obstinate or uncooperative. And a strong working group chair is critical to the whole thing. As a general comment, I would say I'm in favor of forming the working group. I believe for the working group content, it would make more sense for maybe a more structured, rather than a simple linear list, to maybe group things together that belong together so that they can be prioritized and linked together, and then ask for volunteers to write the material and to review it. Following the precedent from DNSX, which predates DNSOP, that process worked extremely well. Anyway, those are my comments.
Suze, if you could wait, I think let's switch the back mic and front mics, alternate.
Okay. Nalini Elkins. I would like to support very much the support for debugging and analysis, and also put in measurement. There was just recently an IEPG presentation where it appears that multiple queries are sent where one would have expected one query for reasons that are not well understood. And these are exactly the kind of issues that we need to be able to understand on certainly the networks that I work on, which are large enterprise networks. We need to be able to manage these protocols, understand what the traffic is. So I would like to see that baked into the protocol.
Suzanne Wolf, first as Jabber Scribe, and then I'm going to plead for the chair's indulgence for a very brief comment as DNSOP co-chair. First from the Jabber room, Chris Lemons. I'm significantly in favor of working group formation. It's unclear to me how to put discussion in scope, but not resolution of disagreement. Resolution of disagreement is a major part of what working groups do. Every working group has to narrow scope of discussion, sometimes taking the discussion offline to breakouts when topics get hot in order to get things done. I think monitoring that conversation is just part of the admittedly difficult work of the chairs. I don't know how the charter should put these topics out of scope, particularly since we'd benefit significantly if we came to consensus on some of those topics. Further, responding to Patrick, Chris Lemons, while it's true that the charter could use improved specificity in deliverables, it's inaccurate to say that there are no deliverables present. There are several specific topics in the charter, like discovery of resolvers, DNS push, and such that could certainly be turned into the basis for the specific working group items fairly directly. Also, as DNSOP co-chair, the DNSOP charter and this one might in fact need some further discussion to refine what goes where. But with that said, the current DNSOP charter was designed in part significantly so that we could in fact push off work to other working groups to support having a narrower or more specific set of skills and constituents in a dedicated working group. So for any of the encrypted DNS topics, for the application specific aspects of these topics, Certainly, I think that what David said as chair of this session is true, that the two working groups would collaborate closely at the AD and at the area and the chairs level. But also, and the DNSOP co-chairs would be happy to discuss which items belong where, but there is nothing wrong under terms of DNSOP history or charter with saying there's a specific set of work items here, they're related to each other, they require specific expertise and interests that are not necessarily present in DNSOP for all of the other things DNSOP does. And there's no reason not to do this if the work items can be grouped and managed properly.
You want to go to the back? Okay. Alyssa Cooper. Just wanted to respond to a couple of things that have been said at the mic. In response to Brian, actually, both of these were designed by committee, so take that for what it's worth. And just piling on to what Sue said, someone had asked, like, if there's a working group that's overloaded, is that a reason enough to create another working group? I think there's a lot of precedent in the art area for splitting off related topics, just so that you can have more chairs, more meeting time, a little bit more of a focused audience. It's something that we've done with several of the protocols in the art area. So I think there is some precedent for doing that. I think given the nature of this set of topics, while I respect the impetus to attempt some process innovation, it's actually like the worst kind of topic to try that. We have a process. It has it has its faults and strengths, but we kind of know how it works. And for something that's as messy as this, people might want to think about maybe we should just use it the way that we know that it is, as opposed to the full consensus thing and trying to overly manage the contention. And the last thing I will say is that one thing I've noticed about this discussion is that people are getting to the point, or maybe already at the point, where they're so dug in that, like, when the person comes to the mic, you reflexively know whether you're going to agree or disagree with them before they've even opened their mouth. And I really think that finding a small set of focused work items that people could collaborate on to actually feel like they accomplished something together, as opposed to sitting in your own camp, is probably the only way to make forward progress here.
Hi,
back mic, please.
Andrew Campling, 419 Consulting. Just building on that last set of comments. I think it's self-evident that there's a need for a working group. There's stuff here that needs to be done that doesn't sit well anywhere else. The two slides, there's far too much for a working group. I think the second slide, there's nothing there of merit that fits in a working group. It all looks like policy. The first slide, if you took the first 4 bullet points on the right-hand side, that looks sufficient for a working group. So I'd make it much more focused, as I say, just agreeing with what was just said. Take those top 4 bullets on the right-hand side, jettison the rest. There's more than enough to be done. It needs to be done in a working group. Thank you.
Philhan Baker, could you go back to the slide with the bits, the next one, I think? Yeah. I'm very supportive of the idea of alternative ways of doing DNS resolution. I've proposed a few over, the past 10 years, whatever. I'm quite worried about this whole thing and the way it's been presented here. I'm really worried about this idea of full consensus. Because basically what you end up doing is you give a preemptive veto on certain approaches, and all security is going to change the balance of power. It's always going to take power away from one group of people and give it to another. And if that group of people you're taking it away from is criminals, that's a good thing. The question, though, we tend to focus on who are you taking the power away from, and what we don't focus on enough is who you're giving it to. And I think that this is one of the problems with DOE, was that it wasn't, people thought, oh, we're taking it away from the people who are intercepting and doing this bad stuff, and you didn't think closely enough as to who you were giving the power to instead and how they were going to be accountable. And what I think that we need to do is always think about giving power to the user, to the individual. And whenever you do that, you're doing the right thing.
Back microphone.
Okay. Ray Bellis, ISC. I think there's definitely some very interesting work to be done. I don't think ART is the place to do it. I view DNS fundamentally as a system service, not an application service. And the bulk of the items that I see there on that list, I think are perfect fit for int area scope, and it should not be part of ART.
So I think we should form this working group. I mean, we've talked a couple of IETFs now about the problems, and we haven't gotten any closer to resolution. And I think one of the reasons is that we don't have a structured discussion, and that's what I was hoping we'll get when we have that working group to actually get this stuff done. And when you look at the two, the left and right side, I mean, if you think the left side through, a lot of the stuff on the right side actually comes through. So just, I mean, get it done.
Okay, Paul Mushene. I've just gone through the draft charter, and the latest changes mention about dealing with topics such as malware detection, privacy, and pervasive surveillance, and also policy controls. Don't you think that you're handling more than you can chew, given that you also mentioned you need full consensus, and that's not easy to get? Thank you.
Yeah, Chris Box, BT. So I support the creation of a working group to solve this. If you go to the previous slide, please. So I'd like that working group to have a specific, narrow, achievable focus, which a lot of people have said. I totally agree with that. So the list on the left there is a little short. The one on the right, you could trim a couple of items from that. But yeah, essentially the message is make it short and applicable and achievable, so that we can make some progress. And the other thing is, yeah, somehow or other work out one working group that is going to address this, resolve a discovery. I don't mind where it is, it just needs to be in one place.
Glenn Deaton, Comcast, NBC Universal. Couple comments. First of all, I do support the creation of the working group. I think it's going, with either list, left or right, it has some very valuable topics on there, which the community of both users and ITFers really could benefit from people getting together and working on. So I think it's important. There's material in the charter and other discussions here, though, about creating a sort of an adjunct or a modified IETF process for getting through the contentious parts of this. I think that's a mistake. I believe in the IETF process. It can be painful at times, but I believe built into it is ways of getting through these contentious issues. Sometimes, by the way, part of the IETF process results in no consensus, and that is an indicator that's valid. We don't have to always drive to an answer, but I think there's work here that we can get to an answer. I think there's, especially if we eliminate discussions which are very policy-centric, that gets into territory that is sort of outside the scope of the traditional IETF, and I think maybe that would remove some of the crazier, contentious feelings that go on, and limit and focus the work to something that could produce results. That's exactly what I said on the ADD list. I'm just up here at the microphone repeating it, so I support creation.
Victor Bertola, Open Exchange. I support the creation of a working group, specifically a new working group, because I think we need a community which is broader than the DNSOP one. And this is because there is actual technical work that is to be done. I mean, there are 3 different deployment models that are emerging, and rather than arguing endlessly which of the 3 is better, I think all 3 of them need some technical parts that are missing. I mean, the people that want to use DOT and the people that want to use DOH with the existing resolvers need the resolver discovery part and possibly other policy discovery path or maybe other additional things. The people that want to use DOH to their own resolver or multiple resolvers now realize that they still need to discover whether there is any local policy. So there's all the canary domain is coming up, and that is also something that needs to be standardized. Because I mean, seen from the viewpoint of a DNS operator, I hope we will not have to support 10 different canary domain mechanisms to be compatible with all 10 different clients that might want to go that way. So I think that there is some pretty urgent, I'd say, technical work that needs to be done to actually make a deployment of encrypted DNS more quicker and more broadly adopted. I will also point out that, I mean, I love discussing the second slide, the policy part of the hardest issues, but I also think that this is not the right place, possibly, to have that discussion. First of all, because there are other people, other non-technical stakeholders that want to be involved in those discussions and that are already discussing this. I mean, and so I think especially the people that are going for the third model will hear from governments, from data protection authorities, from law enforcement people about all the problems that their deployment model is causing. And then I don't want to enter in that's right, that's wrong, and how the discussion will end up. But definitely this is a discussion that is much broader than the IETF and the technical community. So I think it's even better maybe if we don't have it here. Thank you.
Just a quick note, we only have 10 minutes left in the session and 9 people in line, so please be succinct.
Cool, so I'll take 2 minutes. Rich Salzakamai, I don't have much of an opinion, but if it goes in with the process changes, then I'm very strongly opposed to forming a working group. I've given the newcomers tutorial for about 3 years now, and 2 points that we make are rough consensus. Not everybody has to get all their answers solved. And we succeed at making a standard if it gets deployed. And so if somebody can veto discussion or a thread that might prevent them from participating, then this thing is not going to get universally deployed, so it'll fail. I'd really hate for us to do something also that is against our history and an actual real point of pride, right? The slide, rough consensus and running code. Oh, except in this one group where it's only running code that counts. Also, I want to point out, we had an example in the TLS group. I'll use the phrase enterprise TLS, right, with static RSA. And the way we got around it, the way we addressed it, is we got consensus within the group to stop discussing it. And that's what you should do here. If when you find problems that are going to prevent forward progress, the group can say, oh yeah, it's more important for us to do progress, therefore we will have consensus to stop it, and it's up to the chairs to not let the topic come back. Thank you.
So Martin Thompson, I want to go back to what Patrick McManus said here. And I'm hearing from a lot of people that they want to do this in a working group without specifying what this is. And from this set of things that you have up on the screen here, I don't know that we're talking about the same thing. And I suspect that the problem here could be addressed simply by saying, oh, well, we had a great discussion about the sorts of things that people might want to do in this room here. But if we want to continue, we need to have more concrete and focused discussions about specific things, probably backed by, as Rich pointed out, some sort of running code or at least specific proposals. And I saw one on the screen today that was working group sized almost, from Tommy, which I thought was maybe this organization wants to take that on. And I heard a number of different things from different people on this list. And I think that if we set something up with this sort of octopus style scope, we're going to fail in ways that new ways that I can't imagine. Yes.
I think Echo is in line first.
Okay. I think you were actually here first, but I'm happy to talk. So I noticed we're now 6 minutes from the end of the session. Traditionally we try to end these things with some sort of hums. Now maybe that's not possible, but I'd like to see if maybe we can. Back in the day when you used to actually try to edit these charters on the screen, and that was like super cool. So I'm gonna essay one of those things, like a charter that basically has the first 3 items on this list on the right that people want to do and nothing else, and a recharter for later than that. That's something we could actually hum on. Pick some other subset. Oh, sure. Exactly. That is the thing on the left. Perfect. Yes. I mean, there's no sense in which we could do a hum on a this that was like any like that with the discussion we've had so far that wasn't like hyper concrete like I just described. So like now maybe we can do nothing and say like there's no consensus, but if you want to get consensus on something, it's going to have to be something like that.
Hi, Kirsty P and CSC. So I just wanted to note some of the changes in the topics that were suggested to be contentious. So one of them is about the detection and suppression of malware, which I'd like to think at least the aim is not contentious. Whether you disagree on the method, fine, but I'd like to hope that at least everyone can agree roughly on the aim, that it's not a good thing in 2019 to not at least discuss it. Currently with DNS, we see a lot of benefit from various malware filtering solutions. It's all evidenced. We have the protective DNS service in the UK, which has been shown to provide great malware defense, actually, and we've got quite a lot of statistics to back that up. What I would like to see is some discussion about a user's security experience not being degraded without their knowledge. And I think to suppress any discussion around that is really quite a dangerous thing. I'm for forming a working group. I think these are very important issues that need to be discussed. Thank you.
As Richard Barnes, I'll be real brief. I feel like there is probably a working group somewhere in this that I could support. I do not support the formation of a working group with any of the charter versions heretofore produced. I think Alyssa Cooper and Patrick McManus kind of broadly got the right approach here, which is that we need to have some tight focus with clear deliverables that we can produce some value on, which may be among the set here. I think that, yeah, as was mentioned, Tommy's draft captures some of them as well. Probably this kind of local network capability discovery, local resolver capability discovery is the right zone, but I think we need a charter that is much more tightly focused on that before we can make any progress.
Daniel? Oh, so I'm going to be brief. So I support what Rich mentioned. So the consensus should not provide the right to veto. That's the first thing. And the other thing, it's not because we're trying to address a hard question that we should not try to address those. So I don't want to remove those questions from the charter.
Elliot Lear. 2 points. First of all, we've heard a lot about how we shouldn't innovate process and we shouldn't, we need tight charters to accomplish work. We've identified some work that can be accomplished. Of course, a working group is not the only vehicle that this organization has. And it seems to me the items on the right, or at least most of them, are worth discussing. It doesn't mean they have to be discussed in a working group. They can be discussed in an IAB program. They can be discussed at a workshop. They can be discussed in the IETF. I think the point is that when we make changes to the architecture and there are ramifications to those changes, there needs to be a vehicle to discuss those changes. Doesn't have to be a working group, but I would ask the IETF leadership to consider the list on the right and figure out what vehicle the people should use for that, for discussion and actually documentation of those issues. We got here in part because Jim and others wrote a draft. It was controversial. It doesn't mean that we have to have consensus on everything that he wrote, and there are vehicles for producing work where there's no consensus. I want to actually compliment Avri, who is in the back. I think she's over there, where we had a very controversial document come up in HRPC, and she actually discussed, for instance, the meaning of consensus, and she wanted to get even further, but we ran out of time. It was a really good, she had a really good presentation, and we should think about how we have those discussions, because we should take responsibility for the architecture that we're delivering, both the good points and the bad points. I had a second point, but I'll leave it at that.
Really quickly, we are down to just over a minute left, and I want to actually defer to Barry and Alyssa as far as whether they are interested in any sort of even on the general question of are people generally in favor. Let's put the specific charter aside right now, but generally in favor of focusing in a new working group, or passing would be like one hum we could have. I'm curious, is there anything Barry or Alyssa would really like to hear from the end of this session?
After listening to the mic discussion, this is Barry. After listening to the mic discussion, is that better? I don't see anything right now that we could make a hum on in the time that we don't have. So let's defer that to the list. I hear people wanting to work on something. I hear people thinking we can't come up with an agreement on what we can work on. And I hear pretty much universal agreement that the list on the right is too much. So we need to refine that on the mailing list.
Melissa Cooper, this is not really for today, but we have the RFC about considerations on how to have a successful BOF, and it has like very specific questions that are meant to be answered. And if you think about them in advance, then it kind of shapes the way the BOF goes, because then by the end, you know that you have to get the answers. And I was really hoping that that was going to happen today, and it didn't. So now I think the task is to try to make that happen on the list, which is much harder. But I do still think like those questions should be framing people's thoughts, and it's about like deliverables and who's going to do the work and is this the right venue and so on. So I would encourage you to look back at those even though the BOF is over and think about how you can try to test those on the list.
Yeah, so the three people left at the mic, if you'd like to finish up with some comments.
All right, so I'll go. I'll be short. Name is Sanjay Mishra, Verizon. So I think applications are doing DNS, so that's already the fact. So I think keeping that fact in mind, I support a working group that is specifically focused on some of the issues that are listed in the latest draft on the right-hand side. And I think it's a good list. Controversial maybe to some on certain things, but I think it's a good list, and we should really try and see a consensus on what are the items that we can work on. And this group might be a specific venue for those issues. So I think I support forming a group here.
Okay, so I am Emile Stéphane from Orange, and we strongly support the original version here. So discovery, policy, and BCP.
Brian Dixon, GoDaddy. Of the list on the right-hand side, I definitely am supporting the prime numbered ones, 2, 3, 5, and 7.
Thank you, everyone, for your time. We'll be following up more on the mailing list.